Good morning and afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to our Legal Talent and Management Nonprofits Trend webinar today. I hope everybody's going to enjoy themselves. My name is Max Smith. Trying to get my screen to work here. I am with 501c Services. We're a 100% employee-owned company that provides full-service unemployment outsourcing programs to more than 3,000 nonprofits worldwide. Some of our programs include the 501c Agencies Trust and Unemployment Assist. Unemployment Assist helps unemployment insurance taxpayers keep their rates low through better hiring, management, and separation of their employees. Many of you attending today's webcast already work with us, and I thank you very much for doing so. Real quick before we get to our panelists and our content today, going to go over a little bit of housekeeping. Item number one that is not on my bullet points is that I am experiencing internet issues today. We have some issues in my area, so I might go in and out, but I have a coworker, Crystal, behind the scenes who will just keep going with the program if I kind of flitter in and flitter out. So I apologize in advance if any of that happens, but we have had some issues in our area. If you have questions, we will take them as we go, and we will take them at the end. So please feel free to shoot them to us, and we'll handle as many as possible during the next hour. If you need HRCI or SHRM credits, you know the drill for those. When we close the webinar at the end, your survey will pop up, and you just need to fill it out and send it back to me. If you have to run off to another meeting, you'll get that survey in an email in about an hour after the program ends, and you can fill out the survey there, and we'll send you the credits. Also, remember, there's always a question on that survey that says, was the program presented without technical difficulties? So if you have technical difficulties or we have technical difficulties, you hit that button and I'll send you the credit regardless whether or not you attended the whole thing. Obviously, we have a panel discussion this morning, so we don't have a slide deck, but we do have predetermined questions that we have been working on for about a month. The speakers have got notes that they are referring to during those questions, and they have been nice enough to share those notes with us so that you can download them, make notes yourself, make notes on their notes, and follow along if you want. The handout section of the GoToWebinar browser has those three sets of notes in there for Ben, Julie, and Matt, and you can go ahead and download those. Those will also be included in the email later today. All right, now that I'm done with that, I can end the slideshow and we can get on with the real show. This morning joining me will be Julie Gilbertson from 501c Services. She's in Wisconsin this morning, and she evidently has lots of snow. Also, we have Benjamin Freedman. He's the CEO of Weiser Innovations, which is a talent acquisition partner of 501c Services. He's in Seattle. He has no snow. And then rounding out the panel this morning is attorney at law Matt Perdoni. He's the president of the Social Sector Legal Services. He works in Washington, D.C. metro area, and he just has rain. So the weather forecast is done. We can go ahead and get started, and we're going to start with Julie. Julie, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself before I start peppering you with some questions real quick?
Sure, absolutely. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Julie Gilbertson. They call me Jules. And I've worked in the nonprofit world for 27 years as a chief HR officer. I had the pleasure of working for a wonderful nonprofit, Community Bridges in Santa Cruz County. And so lots of great experience with that world, and much respect to those of you that work for nonprofits. I'm currently working for the 501c and delighted to be on board with you as well. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you. I think you're the only person who might have gotten volunteered to be with us this morning. So
I think that's okay.
So unfortunately, I'm going to start, Julie, with COVID-19. I know much of 2020 was weighted down by COVID-19, but we need to start a little bit with that as well today. Can you talk about the issues organizations are going to have this year in response to COVID-19? There appears to be a balance that will have to be maintained with keeping the workplace safe and an employee's personal health decisions in mind. I can imagine there will be issues like employees who will get vaccinated and those who will not, those who will return to work and those who don't want to. So can you talk a little bit of, to start us off, talk a little bit about how employers can begin to prepare for the post-pandemic workplace as you see it now and what maybe they should expect?
Sure. Yeah, this is a really huge topic for sure, and something that everyone's been navigating through throughout this pandemic, and trying to keep up with what feels like a bit of a moving target. So, you know, trying to keep up with the CDC guidelines, state and federal law, public health, OSHA, and city ordinances, as well as assuring that your organization's culture and safety standards are really up to standard in this pandemic. I think even though we're talking post-pandemic, a lot of what we've been dealing with this last year is going to continue for a while. So this may be some of a review for all of you. So bear with me. I think the change in government will also bring us some new, impactful potential changes post-pandemic, and looking at policy and procedure. So I'm looking forward to seeing what that brings. So first and foremost, employers are going to need to continue to provide the proper education, the necessary personal protective equipment, and to set clear guidelines and continue to implement their prevention plans at the different organizations. And although we can't control employees' behavior outside of work, you can have strict guidelines at work for employees and clients. And I know that that's been a challenge at times for folks. I really encourage employers to over-communicate. This has been a tough time for everyone. You have some people in the workplace, some remote, and so over-communicating is really key. Be creative in your thinking. And by that, I will share a great example. I know a CEO who gathered and had a virtual online New Year's Eve party for his employees with a DJ to really encourage them to shelter in place on that holiday and not go out and gather. And so I thought that was super creative, and I just want to acknowledge that that's a way to look outside the box. Moving forward to post-pandemic actions, this masking and social distancing will continue to be essential for a period of time. And then we get to vaccines, and employers may mandate vaccines. So, some might not. That's going to be interesting to see how that all comes down. But we'll have to understand that there'll be some exceptions, protections under ADA. So that interactive process is going to be super important, as you may have to make accommodations for some employees. If you're unionized, which I know not everyone is, but I came from a workplace that was unionized, it's really suggested to meet and confer if you're going to mandate those vaccines. Also, when you look at employees going to get their vaccination, you may need to support that during work hours. And though you might not have to pay for that, it might be a good idea to pay them for their time if you really want to implement this smoothly. However you can support them in getting that done, I think is advisable. And the others might have other, comments on that. So I'll leave that open. Be sure to document all your vaccination records, including refusals, because if you have a workers' comp case, or you're going to potentially need that information for OSHA compliance. So there's a lot of record keeping that needs to take place during this time. And that includes notice requirements if you have a positive case in your workplace. To get to the morale side, as we know, this has had a huge impact on employees, and morale's been tough. Essential workers have mental fatigue, that constant fear of, am I going to get COVID? And just the additional workload with potentially less staff on site. And then you have those that will be returning to the workplace post-pandemic, and they'll have fear as well. So management's going to really need to work together to, be prepared to support that. There's a lot of financial insecurity out there, housing issues, isolation issues, and you know, everything you can imagine that we're all having to deal with through this last year. I would encourage employers to provide, you know, extra support in any way you can. So if that includes counseling or EAPs, employee assistance programs, those are really good additional benefits. So let's face it, this pandemic has caused a lot of fear, and I just think we need to focus on employee morale and reaffirming trust. And in doing that, hopefully you'll have a more secure and productive workforce. So it kind of goes hand in hand. I just want to say that, you know, we understand that this pandemic is not a one size fits all. And, you know, there's a lot of case by case situations that you're dealing with. And so I just want to acknowledge the leaders during these times, especially. And I know that the vaccination topic is just going to add to that. So, you know, thank you so much for your work out there.
Very cool. Thank you. We're going to move. I'm going to go to Matt next. And Matt, why don't you go ahead and let everybody know who you are before I pepper you with some questions here.
Sure. So my name is Matt Perdoni. I'm with Social Sector Legal Services, PLLC. That's based in Washington, D.C. We also have an office in Minnesota. I work with nonprofits, small businesses on a variety of legal matters that ranges everything from business transactions to governance, tax matters, lots of different things in between. Certainly also a component of strategy and advisory services mixed into that as well. So really try to provide everything we can to keep organizations and small businesses effective. And it's been a challenging time for a lot of folks out there. So, you know, hopefully able to provide some useful information and some kind of answers today. But I will certainly say that there's a lot of uncertainty related to all of this from a legal perspective. So we'll just have to keep that in mind.
Right. So Julie mentioned possible mandates around masks, vaccines in the workplace. Can you talk a little bit about what the current state of the law is around vaccines and anything else that an employer might require the employees to do before they come back to work?
Sure. And before I start here, it's always important for me to note that my presentation, the materials, it's all intended for general informational purposes. You know, it's definitely not intended to constitute legal or tax advice, so be sure to consult with your legal counsel or tax professional for any specific advice about particular laws or regulations, rules, policies, things like that. Everything I'm able to talk about here today is based on information current as of yesterday. That does not rule out the possibility of changes to that, so certainly do your own due diligence on that. Yeah, with that, I'll circle back to the questions at hand here. So this area, like I say, and I'll say it many times, I'm sure, is just constantly evolving, and it's really hard to say what's coming down the line. Julie mentioned, for starters, you know, we have a new president, new Congress, so that brings the possibility of more direct role, federal role in responding to the pandemic. So that could be anything from health and safety protocols to vaccination programs. But, you know, uncertain as of now, and certainly worth monitoring. I do want to touch on the brief conversation here anyway about state level considerations. So many of you know firsthand for sure that it's really a patchwork of standards out there. And that's going to be the case when it comes to public gatherings, stay-at-home orders, workplace safety protocols, among many other things. So absent some, you know, binding federal guidance with uniformity, the state-by-state analysis is certainly going to be required. Some states have been really especially ambiguous, honestly, when it comes to this. That left a lot of nonprofits and business owners in a difficult place early on, especially last year. And truthfully, I continue to see a lot of inconsistent information across different agencies within single states. So, you know, don't just rely on one source in most cases. Probably worth looking at multiple state sources and make sure you have some sort of consensus of information there. That ambiguity, I think, is not unintentional. States want to leave themselves some flexibility for enforcement. And I think for a while we're waiting on federal guidance that just didn't come. So all of this, creates kind of that compounding uncertainty that leaves everybody more and more stressed out about all this. But, we'll see if things are clarified in any meaningful respect here soon. So I don't think that necessarily people are in a much better position today, really, than they were a year ago to say, for example, what's the difference or who constitutes essential versus non-essential businesses or employees. But don't forget those analyses you did a while back, dust them off, circle back to them, do them again, knowing what you do now. That's a way to just kind of ground yourself and maybe start the process a little faster. So for those of you with staff coming back into the office or interacting with the public, it's just really important that you have comprehensive policies in place. So this sounds obvious probably, and it is obvious, but I'm mentioning it because it remains a major vulnerability for a lot of the organizations that I'm seeing and dealing with. So first and foremost, your protocols aren't really going to do much good unless they're in writing. If you don't have something in place, or you do have policies, but they're not yet in writing, just check those state health authorities, secretaries of state, governor's offices, so on. Many of them provide model policies, FAQs, things like that that could be helpful. Seeing big gaps still, for sure, in pre-arrival screenings and self-assessments and certifications, along with clear guidance to employees about what to do if the responses require them to stay at home. Again, if you aren't sure, check your state resources in addition to CDC for guidance. And just like it's important to have your policies in writing, equally important to document compliance, both on the part of employees and by you. This is what I've seen people using apps and electronic questionnaires for, with some really positive effect. That eases administration, streamlines compliance, and automatically generates an audit trail for you, which could be helpful. But with all that, it's really, really important. It's really critical that you just keep information private, treat it as confidential. So go quickly here to the vaccine side of things. Julie did mention that the ADA, I would certainly, and I don't want to run too long here, so the materials that I provided has some links in there that are really helpful, and you'll see one from the EEOC titled "What You Should Know About COVID-19 and the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act, and Other EEO Laws," specifically Section K there. That's a good starting point for doing your own analysis, and of course, seek the specific guidance from legal counsel. But I do briefly want to walk through a few considerations, and just keep in mind, changes in federal law, OSHA mandates, all these things really could, change your outlook or change your analysis of this. But as Julie mentioned, you can ask for proof of vaccination independent of a mandated program. Just be careful to limit that inquiry to that issue alone. So don't ask them why they didn't get vaccinated. The simple "did you?" If you're engaging in a voluntary program, consider requiring workers to waive liability and sign off saying they understand that risk, but that's not going to provide you any guarantees necessarily that it's enforceable or that it helps you. It's just, a procedural mechanism at the very least. For anybody considering a mandatory vaccination program, you first need to assess whether it's permissible in light of existing employee agreements, union contracts, and state and local laws are going to bear there for sure. So if you do require vaccinations, but an employee indicates that he or she is unable to receive it because of a disability or a sincerely held religious practice or belief, that's when you have to establish disability and religious exemption accommodation programs. So if an employee can't get vaccinated because of a disability or sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance, and there's no reasonable accommodation possible, then it would be lawful for you to exclude the employee from the workplace. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can terminate them, and that's where it's really careful. You need to be careful to parse these things out. And employees aren't necessarily entitled to a work from home accommodation. So, putting all this together, for example, maybe it boils down to requiring workers to come into work with masks and social distancing in place. That could be a solution in some circumstances. But remember that the ADA requires privacy, so you can't disclose that an employee invoked an exemption and hasn't been vaccinated. I know a lot of information there. Again, that EEOC material, that link really gets into finer detail in all this for sure. So real quick, just recognize that we're all going to be working from home a while longer, it looks like, at least. Whether people are just riding it out until vaccinations are widespread or herd immunity kicks in or whatever it is the kind of timeline is, or if it's, you know, a recognition that this is going to be a regular part of your work environment now. You know, these are things, a few more items here to probably just keep in mind. And again, on those handout materials, but you know, make sure that you're in contact with your insurance providers so that you're covered for the new work environment, new policies, new interactions, all those types of things. You know, making sure that your employee agreements and staff policies reflect clear expectations for, you know, workplace environment, you know, any standards of operations, hours of work, things like that. Fraud is really becoming a more prevalent issue right now. So be sure you're interacting with your finance teams to ensure your internal controls are sufficient in a work from home environment. And, you know, that also extends to cybersecurity, things like that. That's just become a real glaring weakness for a lot of organizations now that staff's scattered across multiple offsite locations. So that's your own data, that's donor and user information. Really just important that you keep that stuff under lock and key, so to speak, and that you know where your vulnerabilities are, try to address them. You know, related to that, website and data privacy policies are becoming more important. That's growing with GDPR, the California Privacy Rights Act, the newer version of the CCPA. Getting a lot of questions about all these things from people, and have started to think about some sort of you know, flat fee or group offering type of thing. So if this is something that a significant number of people see a need for, interest in, certainly let Mac know, let myself know. You know, and there's the possibility that these types of things, which can be kind of standard form in a lot of respects, could be provided in a more reasonable manner for folks than otherwise, you know, just kind of one-off services. So last thing, just don't forget about governance. I was really surprised about how a lot of organizations are just caught flat-footed with electronic board permissions, things like that. So if you don't have those things in your bylaws and your governing documents, now's the time to amend those, get on the right side of things moving forward, and just, you know, be prepared to continue working like this for the foreseeable future. So that's, I'll turn it back to you, Mac.
Geez, thanks, sir. I appreciate that. Excuse me. So I'll head over to Ben now, still talking about the post-pandemic workplace, which still seems to be 9 months away at this point. Ben, before I go ahead and holler at you, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me and putting this together, Mac. So as Mac said, I'm Benjamin Freedman. I run a company called Weiser Innovations. We are set up to do full service talent acquisition. And so that is everything from your talent acquisition strategy and developing that in conjunction with your overall organizational strategy, and then the functional implementation. So it can be anything from applicant tracking system selection and usage. It can be hiring. It can be putting together a pipeline so that when you know you're going to have to hire, you do have that lined up. It's really looking at what needs to happen to have a successful hiring program, and even more that what needs to happen internally so that you're looking at your talent as well, because the goal of talent acquisition is to make sure that your positions are filled in a really timely manner. And so in a lot of cases, and we'll talk about this, it's not just external components set up, but internal components as well. And so in a nutshell, that's what we're set up to do, and that's what we are doing.
Good. Yeah, if you're a client of ours, you probably got an email this morning from Maureen talking about working with Benjamin's team. on your hiring needs. So we'll go ahead and get into some hiring. So Benjamin, hopefully a lot of employers learned some new skills last year when they had to deal with their talent management issues remotely. Are they going to be able to continue to use these methods going forward? Are some here to stay? Are some going to get dropped once they get back into the office? Which modifications to hiring that were put into place last year should be kept going forward? And maybe did you see some bad habits that people need to make sure they don't take with them? They tried last year, didn't work. Don't do that again this year.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there's, what last year taught us, if nothing else, is we need to know how to pivot. It also taught us that there is absolutely no world in which technology is not critical. And it's not just within talent acquisition, it's within talking to our own groups. It's with everything that we do. Technology has become absolutely integral into how we function. And that is no more evident than in the hiring process, because in a lot of cases, we cannot do face-to-face interviews anymore. And that's not going to change. The other thing that it taught us is, because we can successfully remote work, we no longer live in a world where the people we hire are in our backyard. And I know that there are some cases where that's different. If you need somebody on the front lines, if you need somebody implementing a program or working with patients. But in a lot of positions where you're not directly implementing, with somebody else, with a member, it's going to be all technological, and it's going to be that remote model. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. People may not want to come back to the office 5 days a week anymore because they've shown that this works. And so within the hiring function, leveraging technology is not going to change. Remote interviewing is not going to change. As a matter of fact, I think it's just going to pick up more speed as we progress. And what we're seeing is interview processes are able to move faster when we don't have to coordinate to get 5 people in the same room at the same time, and people are able just to log in. It's a lot easier. And so I think that that's something that we learned last year that's going to be critical. And I think with that, one of the things that we've realized is that we actually have to teach how to use the technology. It's not enough just to say, all right, you're going to have a Zoom call when you've never used Zoom before. And so that piece of it, it's not going anywhere. And is something that I would expect as we move forward. We're just going to see a lot more options and a lot even more efficient ways of doing it. So that's something that I think we've learned and it's going to stay. I also think we've realized how important branding is and being able to appeal to candidates. It's obvious that there are a lot more candidates right now than there's ever been. And it's unfortunate because it's a result of the pandemic. It's a result of furloughs, cutbacks, layoffs, organizations closing, funding dropping. It's not a result of we've now trained, an extra 15 million people and we have an increased workforce. But what it's shown us is that we really have to be able to appeal to get the candidates we want to our organization. And some of those things that candidates want to see, they want to see the stability of the organization. They want to be able to know that if they join a group, that group is going to be there for a while. That's becoming increasingly important. They want to know what the policies are on remote working and flexible schedules. As we're now homeschooling, and as we're now taking care of other family members, and as even those of us with pets and having to deal with those interruptions, being able to have a flexible schedule is really becoming something that is really important. And this is something that organizations are going to have to speak to. And more than just in talent acquisition, but culturally. But it is things that candidates want to know about. As Matt and Jules were talking about, the safety protocols. If anyone's going to be joining a new organization, especially if they have to be on site or in front of people, what does that look like? How you can't 100% ensure that people are going to be safe, but are you providing me with equipment? Do you have a program in place for worst case scenario? I get sick at work. What are you, how are you going to do this? Because candidates want to know that, as people said, they're scared. And, this is not something that people take lightly. They want to know what organizations do if there is a reduction in force or if they have to furlough. How are you taking care of them? How are you helping them? If you're not able to sustain them. Even more than that, do you have anything set up so that if you do have to remove one position, maybe there's an opportunity for another position? And that's something that I'm definitely going to talk about more. And then it's transparency, especially when people are scared. Being able to know what's going on gives them security. They want to be able to have those conversations. And this is one of those times where we just have to be honest and, let people in, and a lot of times that answer is, look, we don't know yet. We're figuring that out. But if you have something to say, let us know. And these are all things that we have to incorporate into our hiring processes so that candidates want to become part of our organizations. And they're so much more critical now than they ever have been. And I think that's one of the lessons learned. And that's one of the things that I don't see retreating at all. And it's actually a good thing. These are things that help build a workforce, it helps build the culture, and it helps appeal to people and lets them know that, the mission, the values, those are things that are transcendent. One of the things that I just touched on, which I think is extremely important, and I think we started to see this in 2020. I think it's going to be even more prevalent in 21 and 22. And that is really that talent acquisition does not mean we bring people in from the outside. And that's something that, it's one of the reasons I started my company, because people think that talent acquisition is equivalent to recruiting, and it's not. And a place where a lot of organizations miss the boat is that they don't realize that the best talent they can have for their organization is already there. And when we are doing cutbacks and we are doing furloughs, before we start hiring from the outside, how do we look at who we have and set them up for something new, either through career pathing or through succession planning? And that's something that I don't think has been done a lot. But when we look at the most cost-effective way to fill a position, it's with somebody internal, both in terms of money, in terms of time, in terms of employee engagement, in terms of branding. When people know that an organization invests in them, that's huge. It's absolutely huge. And so that's one of the things, nobody wants to lose people that are really valuable to them, and to be able to give them the tools to move them forward, it not only helps the organization, but it helps those people. And that's something that we have to keep in, and that has to be part of our talent acquisition strategy. And it also has to be part of the overall organizational strategy and human resources strategy. And that's where these functions really need to be working together.
Right.
The next area that I see is really the focus on driving diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this has to be part of the hiring process. We first need to understand what our biases are. If we understand where we have biases, both overtly and unconscious, it'll help us to ensure that we're bringing in people that we may not have brought in before, or we're looking at people that we may not have looked at before. And to understand we all have them, and even when we're aware, we're not getting rid of them 100%. But at least if we're conscious of what some of the things are that cause us hesitancy, we can address them. And it's looking at that within how we hire. It's expanding our hiring pipelines and how we look for candidates. It's creating diverse hiring panels. And one of the things I'll talk about in a little while is what diversity is. But we need hiring panels that are reflective of the organization holistically. And that's different departments. It's people that are, it's not just we're going to have this type of person do the interviewing. And then we really need to make sure that we're leveraging the data that we get from talent acquisition, but also organizationally, to make sure that we're aligning with the overall DEI goals. And that part of it is huge. We collect a lot of data when we're hiring. And to be able to look at that and go, all right, we're doing a great job reaching out to this population, but we're not doing a great job reaching out to another population. What are we going to do about it? And it's looking at that to drive our decision making and to drive our strategy. And when we look at a lot of the DEI initiatives that have really taken off in the last year, and this isn't anything new, but it's been especially prevalent in the last year with a lot of the social movements taking place externally. It's really the talent acquisition people, the recruiters that lead this. We're the people that bring people into the organization. So if we're not the ones focused on a diverse candidate pool, the organization's not going to have it. And so that's one of the things that I think organizations are seeing, and where this function is absolutely mission critical in making that happen.
Absolutely, absolutely. Jules, since Ben went ahead and opened the DE&I topic, which
You're welcome.
I know it's amazing. It's like it was planned. It was amazing how last year how the cultural issues ran parallel to a pandemic. It's almost like we had extra time on our hands to look around at what was really around us. So from an HR's perspective, from your own experiences, running an HR department the past couple of years, how does the HR department help an organization evolve and embrace DE&I? What modifications need to be made in writing? What needs to be made in attitude and spirit? I mean, we can write things down in a book somewhere and make everybody sign it, but it doesn't mean there's change. So how does HR make this all work?
Boy, that's a great question. And yeah, thanks, Ben, for leading into that. It's really an important topic for leadership to address, and HR really needs to be a key partner in embracing it. It's as you said, it's always been there, but now we have these social movements and things happening in our world that are really front and center, and so we have to make it a priority, in every organization. I think strategizing with your leadership team to start, look at your strategic plan, make sure that, this is, taken into consideration, and then meet and train all your staff. You're going to have staff say, I'm fine with this. I don't have any problems. This is really important. And though it might be uncomfortable for folks, it's key for all of us to continue learning and growing in this area. Including staff perspectives on diversity, equity, and inclusion means, and what that means to them. I think that's important to come to a shared definition, and that way they'll own it. We can all model it, and understanding that it's essential in every organization. So creating policies and procedures that reflect that is essential as well. You need to look at, as Ben said, your hiring practices, but also job descriptions, organizational communication, possibly even your dress code. You might not even realize you have something in your dress code that is not reflective of that. And then your core values, they need to be reevaluated and to ensure that the key components are included. For example, if your current recruitment practices aren't working, as Ben said, you got to think outside the box and look at other options and explore other ways to bring a good diverse pool of staff and board positions in. And then your interview panels, they need to be diverse and really reflect your agency's mission. So really good points from Ben there. It's important to have all your written and verbal communications in the languages that best serve your employees. If if that's needed, you really need to take a look at that. And you might have an employee that wants to take a language class to strengthen that, if that's a barrier. So I would definitely support that as well. It's important for employers to provide a diversity and anti-racism training for all staff and board members. And then also more communication at this time, reminders about your discrimination and harassment complaint procedures that are currently in place to make sure that is, known by all staff. The trainings, I would include the unconscious biases, microaggression. You might even consider looking at the implementation of gender neutral and non-binary pronoun language in some of your documents or your signature lines. There's a lot of ways to really embrace this. And then, of course, as we know, there's current laws for anti-harassment training for all staff, and that needs to be tracked and monitored. Beyond, though, the written policy and trainings, it's important for organizations to really look at their organization's core value statements, and then more importantly, to model that. It needs to start at the top, and that way, all employees, including management, really see that consistency, and there's a shared vision for expected behaviors and practices that everyone can be held accountable for. And it's not easy, but it's really definitely, it's so crucial that we embrace this at this time, and it takes a village, so HR needs to be engaged with that as well.
Great, thank you. Matt, I'm going to push it over to you now on the same topic. Obviously, I think when organizations try to implement, diversity and inclusion programs, things can go wrong. They can do them improperly. They can do half measures. They can just do lip service, or they could actually try and just do something that's ineffective. And then if you get it wrong, then it can cause problems with branding and image, PR, fundraising. I believe boards can get into legal trouble. So what ethical and legal role does nonprofit governance have related to what Jules was just talking about when HR is trying to get policies implemented? What do the guys at the top need to be doing as well, and gals at the top?
Yeah, so I think it really comes down to transparency and accountability. Nonprofit governance is certainly a broad term, in my view, that covers a lot of what was just discussed, everything from day-to-day hiring policies, but up to the board meetings and things like that. So, Mac, when you say that things go wrong when programs are improperly or ineffectively implemented, I think that's exactly right. I see that happening most often where an organization makes a broad declaration without any real substance behind it. So when I said transparency and accountability, what that ends up being is transparent in all the wrong ways. The type of transparency that the public is increasingly demanding that you should aspire to, in my opinion, is the clearly articulated standard for what DEI means to your organization, and then a roadmap for how you intend to accomplish it. So I think just echoing exactly what was said a moment ago. So this standard would be embedded in your hiring policies, employee manuals, for all your internal stakeholders to see, to hold you accountable to, and then when executed in that manner, will help you build the workplace and culture that you envision. So, there's purely demographic ways to approach that, I think. But one way you might consider bolstering your DEI efforts would be through compensation benchmarking. That could be a helpful tool to ensure that you're equitable in your compensation practices, and also help show that you're undertaking good faith efforts to get there in the event that becomes an issue or is ever called into question. As I'll talk about about, I think, in a little bit here. There's some other areas where that could become helpful and may even be required for your organization. So, I referenced earlier, there's some topics or issues that are just they're coming up a lot. I'm seeing them from a lot of different types of organizations in different places. So, if there's an interest in those types of benchmarking reports or things like that, specifically when the legal opinion that comes with those in some instances would be helpful. Certainly want to hear that from folks, and I'd say let Mac know as well. I mean, it's all about trying to find ways to start to fill some of these gaps for people and put folks in a better position to be, rather than always being on the defensive about these types of things. There are ways to be proactive that are not just check the box proactive, but actually can help push you forward in meaningful ways. That accountability, like I talked about, I think you can help protect yourself, but also really advance some of these causes. So, I think the DEI standard can be further captured and protected by a properly crafted whistleblower policy, even standalone provisions in your bylaws, things like that. I've certainly seen some folks do that. All of that extends to transparency and accountability to external stakeholders for sure, in addition to internal. So, going back to another point that was made, I mean, getting that tone from the top, that buy-in from your board, and getting the board involved in this process in a meaningful way can be strategically and procedurally very beneficial. So it helps your organization get set up to make good decisions and make good on these commitments. So board committees, I think, can be especially effective for these purposes. So advisory committees that mix external stakeholders of board members, another way to approach this or think about this. Create a formal line of communication and work with the community where one may not otherwise exist. So, bring this all back together. I think that governance is the mechanism for implementing DEI initiatives and puts everybody concerned in a place where they can know what the goals are and how they'll be achieved. I think briefly related to, it's worth noting that something that's emerging parallel to DEI is environmental, social, and governance, ESG, or whatever we consider to be the nonprofit equivalent of that. Organizations are increasingly being called upon to go beyond just divesting certain environmentally unfriendly portfolio holdings. So the mandate now is to actively make decisions to achieve measurable environmental outcomes. I say that this is evolving in parallel. I mean, if you think about it, you can see some similarities in kind of, broader social good, social objectives beyond maybe even what an organization is directly focused on. But the idea being that if everybody does their part, so to speak, then the collective would be better off for it. So, again, you can either sit back and wait for people to force you to do it, or you can take some proactive steps to think about that and start to do it in ways that actually, can work for your organization in lots of different levels. So one more under the transparency and accountability header, I'd say related to governance issues is donor disclosure and acceptance policies. California requires organizations to disclose tax information about their largest donors to the state, but that's being challenged now actually before the Supreme Court, so we'll see if that remains. You'll all recall what happened related to various donations and unwinding of those related to the Jeffrey Epstein. So, things that, again, now that we have examples out there of how things can go wrong, everybody taking a moment to reflect on that, think about what it means to your organization and how you can be in a better position and not just be responsive, but actually, ahead of some of these things. So going back to one quick point there about, not treating these as just risk mitigation or things like that. Like, this is really an opportunity to better connect with the people inside your organization, outside your organization. So, I love working with organizations that really try to identify these types of opportunities. And if you have general or outside counsel you engage to lead risk assessments or, do disaster strategy planning, things like that, chances are those same kind of exercises are just a step removed from evolving into real strategy sessions that, turn these defensive or reactionary posturings into real meaningful change in how you carry out your mission. So, just if you think about it that way, I think there's some real potential to be unlocked for the sector for sure.
Thank you. I know this topic requires more than just 15 minutes in a 60-minute webinar. But Ben, you kind of kicked us off here. Was there anything you wanted to cover real quick at the tail end of it on the hiring side? Because obviously recruitment is important with diversity, as you can see.
Yes.
Yeah, I could have done better recruiting this panel, right? Not really following our own rules here, doing the best we can, but maybe you could touch on just a little bit about hiring before we move on.
Absolutely, and I'll try to move quickly. So I think from a hiring perspective, something that I hear a lot is, we need to have diverse candidates, or, talk to me about how you recruit for diversity. It's really important to understand. I have no idea what that means when that comes to me. And the reason is because diversity is exactly that. It can be anything. And so what's really important for organizations to understand is they have to define what diversity is, what it is for them, where they're lacking, and what those needs are. And that has to be something that is written down. That has to be something that is clearly defined. Because when you ask for diversity, again, it's so ambiguous. And it's really important that that gets clarified. And then just to piggyback on Jules' point, when you are doing your job description, think about what you're putting in when you say years of experience. When you only post in specific areas, are the people that you want to appeal to able to get access to it? Are you turning off an entire population because you say, must have 15 years of experience? That affects people, how you write that. It affects gender, it affects age, it affects racial identity, it affects a million different things. So we definitely need to be aware of that. And then to move quickly, when we are thinking about candidates, also understand that no one person is diverse. People are unique, and diversity is when you have various unique people within a group. That makes the group diverse. Understanding that, well, if I hire one person of this group, it doesn't make you diverse. It means you got a unique person. So it's really important to keep that in mind as you're hiring. And I do know that I'm trying to get through this pretty quickly, but it's also important that when you do your hiring, no matter who it is, everyone gets the same process. That is absolutely critical, to the point where, people do bring suits and do make claims if they feel, or if they know someone that gets a different type of interview experience, different type of hiring process. And it's also important to remember that, like I said earlier, there's got to be training about this. People have to understand what it means to include. And this has to be a standard operating procedure for organizations. It's absolutely critical that this is built into the fabric of the organization, because it's only something that's going to continue to grow. And as we become more aware of embracing our differences, it's something that we have to do. And obviously this is something I can talk about for hours. I would love to. Feel free to contact me. We can go offline with it. But I do want to be respectful because I know we have a time limit here. But definitely writing it down and defining is absolutely critical, or there's not going to be success.
Absolutely, absolutely. And like we said, this is definitely a topic that needs to be discussed further than the 20 minutes we gave it. Just to remind everybody that there are more notes than we are covering here in those handouts that our speakers provided in the handout section. So please feel free to download those. There are some links in there. Matt referred to a couple of links he's provided, and you want to get those. And if you can't figure it out, don't worry, I will email them to you later today. And also, we do have some time at the end here for some questions if anything came up. I know this type of format doesn't really lend itself to a lot of questions, but because we're just asking questions. But if you have some, shoot them to us now. We'll see what we can get to. But I want to kind of end with Matt. I know you have some part of your handout. You do have some information in there about tax obligations that organizations might need to be kept aware of as legislation is passed hither and to, changing the way unemployment works, changing the way this works, changing the way that works to deal with everything that we're having to handle right now in the country. So could you go over briefly what's perhaps in your handout that people need to take a look at later offline to keep them abreast of all this stuff?
Yeah, and I think that checking that handout out and the links there is definitely a good idea. I mean, rather than even me just kind of touching on a bunch of those, I'll hit the real high notes here very briefly, but certainly point everybody to those links and whatever else you might find. You know, there's legislation that was passed at the end of 2020 that's had an impact on some of the programs and policies that were initially part of the COVID response from at the federal level anyway, and there is going to be more down the line here, it looks like. So in the meantime, just being familiar with what's out there, what's been extended, how it may affect your organization, what might be available to you, really just important. So, you know, check those links out. Also, there is, you know, some of the obligations that may apply to you or definitely apply to you. So, you know, some electronic filings requirements now for organizations. So all Form 990 series, 1023, 1024, the IRS forms, you know, the electronic filing is being pushed into the, you know, from the norm to the requirement. So just be aware of that. So from an enforcement and compliance standpoint, there's a link to what used to be known as the exempt organizations work plan. Now it's the compliance programs and priorities page. Just briefly touch on a couple of things of high importance there. So worker classification. So the IRS wants to ensure that organizations aren't reducing their tax burden by incorrectly treating workers as independent contractors instead of employees. You know, just real quick, the classic legal analysis of employee versus independent contractor revolves around three elements: consent, benefit, control. The element of control is the one that, you know, changes a lot really based on what the current circumstances are. So if you no longer have employees reporting to an office, working under someone's direct supervision in that office during standard hours of operation, like those are the things that were the kind of core of that piece of it previously, and now that isn't the case. So could you say every employee is now an independent contractor? No, but you know, if there's a opportunity maybe to, you know, this is just a gray area, notoriously gray area. So with those determinative factors now pretty fluid, it may be an opportunity to consult with HR, finance, legal teams and see if there's any opportunities for you there. The excess compensation, you know, Tax Cuts and Job Act imposed a 21% excise tax on compensation over $1 million to the five highest paid employees in exempt organizations. So IRS is very comfortable, it appears, reading the tea leaves, enforcing that now, as opposed to like the UBIT siloing rules, for example, where there's just been a long period of trying to help people come along with it and understand that they view this as cut and dry and are ready to start holding people accountable to it. So that applies to you, you know, be aware and be ready. At the state level, I can't comment state by state anyway, don't have time for it, thankfully. But, you know, you probably have a better idea at the state level of what your enforcement organizations might be looking at. You know, what's in the news, what are you seeing other organizations dealing with? But also think back to, you know, post 2008 financial crisis, for example. You know, with states were facing budget problems then and like they are now. So if you ever, you know, some states, for example, got rid of exemptions to property tax payments for nonprofits. And, you know, if that was something that was considered, but ultimately, you know, went by the wayside, it may come up again now. So things like that have happened in the past, just, you know, be aware, be prepared to, you know, let your elected officials know what you do, how important it is, you know, the good you're doing, and really, you know, don't be silent in this process. So I'll leave it at that and kick it back to you, Mac. I really covered a lot of ground there, hopefully.
Really. No, that's okay. That's okay. That's why we have the notes. That's why the notes were included. So, and with that, we're out of time. So you might actually find some items to read in the notes that were not covered today because we obviously didn't get to everything we wanted to, but we knew that would happen. But I just want to thank everybody for attending today, guys. I appreciate your time and you all spending the past couple of weeks working on this with me. And if the audience has further questions, check out those attachments. They've got everybody's contact information. These folks are very nice people. They don't mind answering a couple of questions via email or phone call. So feel free to bother them as much as you want. So,
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt.
thank you, guys. Have a great remainder of your day. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.